Guys, welcome to the I Love CVille Show. It's great to be with you. It's Monday. I hope the weekend treated you well. Fabulous time to be alive here in Charlottesville in Central Virginia. We had a great time at Dog Fest. Almost 5,000 people showed up to support the animal community across Central Virginia. That was yesterday at Ix Art Park. I'll tell you what, I've been so excited for today's program. Charlottesville City Councilor Kathleen Galvin is on set with us. Same with Scott Beyer, the president and founder of the Market Urbanism Report. We're going to talk housing. We're going to talk real estate. We're going to talk about the future of Charlottesville's housing ecosystem on today's program. And we're going to do it in kind of, I'm hesitant to use the word debate because of the connotations associated with that word. A friendly forum, I think, is a better description. But I'm going to do it in a way where we're going to kind of monitor time limits so we can hit a lot of questions coming in. I'm literally getting DMs now with questions from you, the viewer. And if you'd like to chime in with any questions, we're certainly happy to do that. Just put it in the comment section on any of the feeds you're watching. You can also send me a DM on Instagram, on Twitter. If you have my phone number, you can send me a text message as well. We'll thank two sponsors that make the program possible. I Love CVille and V&V Brands. We're an advertising agency. We are lucky to work with some of the best clients in Charlottesville. One of them is Interstate Pest and Service Companies. This business started in 1969 with the first generation. His name is Mr. Robert Wells, was Mr. Robert Wells. And he said in 1969, I'm going to start a company. He used his personal truck and sweat equity and pay phones around Charlottesville to build the business. Today, Interstate Pest and Service Companies, over 4 generations of family strong, almost 100 employees and a footprint that is across the Commonwealth of Virginia. I love entrepreneurial success stories like that. We also love working with Dr. Wagner of Scott Wagner Chiropractic and Sports Medicine. Dr. Wagner is changing people's lives one adjustment at a time. Chiropractic care, physical therapy, sports medicine. Dr. Wagner has your back. Judah Wickhauer, why don't we go to the studio camera and let's welcome Kathy Galvin to the show. How are you?
Hello, fine. Good to see you, Jerry.
It's good to see you as well. Thank you for coming.
It's a pleasure.
Scott Beyer, you're looking very sharp, sir. Nice suit, nice tie. Hello.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on, Jerry.
Our pleasure. I want to salute Scott for helping organize this. And we're going to talk about housing. I'm so pumped about this. One of our passions, certainly one of your passions as well, an architect, a journalist who covers housing across the country. We're going to do this in an organized fashion. I'm going to give each person a minute per topic and then 45 seconds to respond to the person that's sitting across from them. So we're going to put them on the clock. I got my friendly stopwatch here on the iPhone, and I'm going to start with Kathy Galvin, and this will be the noise we hear when the minute's up.
Okay.
Good. So the first question we're going to throw to Kathy Galvin, our esteemed counselor, is your State of the Union on housing in Charlottesville, Virginia. You have a minute, Councilor Galvin.
Well, we do have an acute affordability crisis that was identified for the city back in April 2018 when the Partners for Economic Solutions did a housing needs assessment. And in that report, it was identified that at this moment in time, 3,300 households have a severe housing need. That means they're spending over 30% of their income in housing costs, to pay housing costs. Now, our understanding of affordable housing predates that April 2018 report. In fact, over a decade ago, the Housing Advisory Committee was instituted to solve our housing problems. There was a document produced that set a goal of 15% affordable housing citywide. Unfortunately, we have known for many years now that we're at 10% affordable housing as measured by this 80% of annual median income. That is woefully underrepresenting what we now know we need, which I believe is closer to 25% affordable housing based on what we've learned with the housing needs assessment. So the need is acute. It's related to the fact that urban life, living in small cities, big cities, medium cities, has become attractive.
Nicely done, Kathy. Very in the time limit right there. Well done.
No.
Scott Beyer, your State of the Union of Housing in Charlottesville, Virginia, sir.
My State of the Union would be that Charlottesville I agree with Councilor Galvin, it has an affordable housing crisis. The area median is well above the national average and the Virginia average, and it is growing at a faster rate than in either of those cases. An assessment that I read said that we have a 4,000 unit affordable housing shortage, and we probably have if you count market rate units, it's probably much bigger than 4,000. The problem that I see is that we don't build enough housing, and the reason for that is some combination of restrictive zoning, both in the city and in Albemarle County, and mixed with the fact that we do not have people in office who are willing to loosen this zoning so that we can meet our housing needs.
45 seconds. We're going to give each person a chance to respond. 45 seconds. Kathy, you are on the clock.
Well, I have been a proponent of changing our zoning ever since I've been on city council. In fact, one of my first resolutions was to do just that. Here we are 7 3/4 years later, and we have still not embarked on changing our zoning ordinance. I was well aware of the fact that we are highly restrictive at that point. Our R1 zoning really limits the amount of housing types. I was the one that introduced to this community the idea of the missing middle housing type, something that you see pervasive in the older parts of our city, North Downtown, even Rose Hill Drive in Belmont. Those are the kinds of ways, and when I talk about missing middle, that's the small multiplexes, that's the small apartment buildings that can fit within the physical form of an established legacy neighborhood that may be dominated by single-family detached homes, but it doesn't destroy the physical character.
45 seconds. Scott Beyer, sir, you are on the clock.
I would have much of a more holistic view of how we should be addressing our zoning. It's not addressing zoning in specific corridors. I think it is addressing zoning and rezoning the entire city. That includes the residential neighborhoods as well. And I think it depends on what your definition of missing middle is. Everybody has slightly different ones, but I'm not just a add ADUs and duplexes type person. I would say we need to rezone significantly higher than that. In the absence of doing that rezoning, and I understand that it's very politically difficult, we can at very least allow special use permits and PUD applications to go through, because bottom line, as you say, we're not about to change our zoning holistically and comprehensively. It doesn't seem like that's the case politically. So at least allow the case-by-case special use permits to go through.
Okay, one question in the books. A lot of people watching now. Neil Williamson watching the program from the Free Enterprise Forum. Grace says, Councilor Galvin, thank you for your service to Charlottesville. Scott Beyer, you're getting some props right now from Lance Truslow. Attaboy, Scott. Very well-spoken, sir. Greg Bartletsky, welcome to the program. And give it a like and a share on any of the streams that you're watching. We will head to the second question. I think this is something that undoubtedly is impacting our community. How about the proliferation of R1 zoning? Over half of our land zoned for single-family detached homes. Your thoughts on that topic? We'll give you a minute.
Well, that's also a legacy, I think, of post-World War II America, where there was the American dream of having the single-family detached home, but on a large lot. I want to stress the large lot piece, because that was also at a time when you had the GIs coming back. There was a lot more emphasis on providing mortgage insurance. They were getting educations on the GI Bill, so they were becoming upwardly mobile. I will underscore the fact that those two tools were not available to the African American community. And that is something that's going to play into the remainder part of my answer, because I am not going to say I'm averse to single-family detached home ownership. I'm not going to say I'm opposed to single-family attached home ownership. This is not the time to be pulling out from under the rug, especially of our African-American communities that have been denied the right and the ability to buy homes, to acquire wealth. The wealth gap in this country is enormous. This is not the time to remove that opportunity to build wealth from our more marginalized members of our community. So I think the idea of single-family detached home ownership in and of itself is not a bad thing in any way.
Scott Beyer, my friend, a minute on the clock for you, sir.
Well, I think the insistence on single-family home ownership and single-family zoning perhaps makes sense in some places, but it also does not make sense in many places. And I would argue that Charlottesville is a place where there should not be any single-family zoning, because our population pressures are such and our demand is such that we need to accommodate more people within our 10 square miles. And I would actually say that keeping single-family zoning alive and well in this city makes those options and makes housing affordability. It actually restricts low-income minorities from being able to buy homes, because basically it says that in order for the right of home ownership in this city, you have to be able to afford a large lot and a single home on that lot. And because land prices are so high in the city, people can't afford to do that. So I think that in the abstract, yes, single-family zoning may make sense in some places, but I don't think it makes sense in Charlottesville, and it's actually become a form of exclusion that only it's made our city exclusive.
Councilor Galvin, you have 45 seconds to respond.
As we like to say in architecture, the devil is in the details. And I want to underscore the idea of the large lot. We currently have in our zoning a minimum 50-foot wide lot size. That is enormous. Yeah. We can get down to 30 feet. We can get down to a small lot, single-family detached home. I also want to bring up that we are in discussions right now with a tool called a form-based code that uses height bonuses to incent putting affordable housing on site. In one of its subzones called T4, it does allow for a blend, a mixture of single-family detached, but also missing middle. We're getting away from this idea of single-use, single-type, single-income level being zoned. We've got to get away from that. I agree totally with Scott. We need to mix it up. We need to broaden what is allowed in our different zoning areas, but the idea of building in transition zones from areas of low-intensity development to high-intensity development is a value in this community, as evidenced by the reaction of the legacy neighborhoods on West Main Street to flats as well as to the standard.
45 seconds. Mr. Beyer, your show.
Well, I would say that even if we say we do reduce the minimum lot size from 50 square feet, you said 50 square
50 feet wide.
50 feet wide down to 30 feet wide, the basic economic principle that I'm still talking about holds, which is that even if we put one unit on that lot, it's still by process excluding people, because it's excluding people who even can't afford that much land. My whole thing is that if we put, say, 2 units on that lot or 8 units on that lot, you're dividing the cost of the land across 8 different units, across 8 different households. So that's how you make the area affordable, because you're dividing the fixed costs across different households. And so, yeah, I think there's a little bit too much of an obsession with zoning in general in this city, and the idea that we necessarily have to zone certain areas. I don't really see if you're going to do a cost-benefit analysis of every single regulation, it's not clear to me what the benefit of those regulations are.
Another question has come in. We now have the Richmond Times-Dispatch tuning into the program. John Kerber, developer, Prophet Ridge, custom home builder, Dominion Custom Homes is watching. Nicole Scroa, developer, is watching the program now. Thomas Jefferson Community Land Trust watching right now. We'll start with Scott on the next topic here.
Okay.
This question has come in from Roger Voyenze, the real estate
All
agent.
right.
Land, labor, and lumber are the vectors of housing. Which of these 3 are most likely to be reduced in order to reduce home sales prices in Charlottesville, Virginia? Interesting question. You have a minute, sir.
Land, absolutely. The land prices, labor and lumber are fairly fixed and consistent across the economy. I mean, it varies a little bit by market, but land is the thing that really gets inflated. The price of land is expensive in Charlottesville because there's a lot of demand for living here, and if you rezone the land for higher densities, the price of the land will actually increase. But to bear down on a point I just mentioned, if we increase the number of units on that land, then the cost of the land is divided across separate units. So yes, land is the biggest factor. That's the thing we need to be paying attention to, and we need to look at the land economics and how zoning affects that.
Councilor Galvin.
I totally agree. Land value inflation is a huge problem in the city, and that's why we do need to have things like a land bank to begin allowing us to acquire and repurpose a lot of underdeveloped land in this city so that we get it back into being a functioning, productive piece. That's why we've had this tool called small area planning, looking at areas like River Road, looking at areas like the Ix site, looking at areas along Preston and West Main. So the idea is that, unfortunately, when the market is left to its own devices, it is not building enough affordable housing. The numbers of units that we have seen grow along West Main Street have not produced 1 unit of affordable housing in them. So the idea of either or is not tenable. You've got to do both. You've got to be intentional about producing affordable housing with your low-income housing provider partners, as well as put incentives in place like height bonuses to make the development community build affordable units on site. Otherwise, we're going to be just stuck using the special use permit, which has been woefully inadequate in terms of even providing us the revenue we need to build affordable housing.
45 seconds to respond.
I absolutely have a response. To say that the market is not producing affordable housing is a very, very flawed statement, because the reality is that we do not have a functioning market. We have an extremely regulated city. Okay, so it's very limited, the types of housing and the amount of housing that can be built on any given lot. Furthermore, it's very hard to get housing approved, which adds more costs to the project, to any approved project. Those costs end up getting passed down onto the consumer. So I think it is flawed to say that we don't have a market. The reality is that the reason we have expensive housing in Charlottesville is something that the government has created. It's been created by government regulations.
45 seconds, Councilor Galvin.
I think it's been market demand that's created the inflation of our land values because people want to live in cities. And I also am a real strong proponent of choice. I do think we need to provide a range of housing types so that the consumer themselves can actually have a choice of where they want to live, how they want to live, and then make a profit on what they sell. So I think the idea of the government being the sole responsible agent in the inflation of the land is also a very extreme statement. I think what you've got is, and I will agree on this one, a special use permit can add 2 years to an approval process. We have got to do better. We have got to make sure that we have our by right zoning right, and that when it comes in and it checks all the boxes and it's transparent, people are well aware what that zoning is supposed to do, then it gets approved, hopefully within 30 to 60 days. It is not acceptable, absolutely agree, that we have a situation where by right zoning can even take up to 2 years to get approved.
Right.
But you add that extra level of uncertainty, it's adding speculation.
Another question. This one starts with Kathy Galvin on here. We have a number of questions coming in. John Russell, one of your colleagues, has put a question on the feed. I'm going to tag team this question. It's about ADUs, auxiliary dwelling units. And Councilor Galvin, how can they be leveraged to alleviate the affordable housing crunch in Charlottesville, Virginia? You have a minute.
So they, as I understand, they're called accessory dwelling units. And one of the models that I have been looking into, and that we will be getting actually a summer report from a team from Portland, Oregon, is a Portland model where we encourage private property owners to build accessory dwelling units on their property, and that in partnership with nonprofit housing providers who will actually then lease that unit, build that unit, lease that unit, and lease that unit then to a low-income family or household, and they will manage that property. It's a way to get a win-win out of those large lots that are single-family detached, and that you have then a partnership with the government, a nonprofit working with individual homeowners to put affordable units on their sites. And I'm also a proponent of alleys. I think we need to make sure that our alleys are built, are accessible, and then they can provide an address for our accessory dwelling units that then are helping us meet the needs of our affordable housing community. Period.
Senor.
I largely agree with Councilor Galvin. I think that ADUs are a deregulation form that has been long overdue, and I think it's something that can add new housing to our overall supply. It's also something that is generally, it collects lower rents and satisfies a lower end of the market that currently can't afford the larger lot zoned areas, and so it's a smaller unit that I think will be acceptable to the working class. I do want to, earlier what I stated about the market though, I understand that land prices and home prices are high because we have a lot of demand, but when you combine that with the fact that we have severely restricted the land and how it can be used in both Charlottesville and Albemarle County, that has furthered the problem because it has intensified the housing crisis. It has reduced the amount of housing that can be built. So when people say the market, I just want to be clear that we don't have an organic personification of any sort of market in this city. we have something that's been severely distorted and inflated because of our land use policies.
Councilor Galvin, 45 seconds.
I just want to just use it as an example, the kind of redevelopment that has gone on West Main Street. That has popped since the recession ended, I believe, in 2010. And so while I was on council, I saw that corridor grow based on zoning that was put in place in 2003. And so the luxury student housing developments that were put in place have actually provided a lot of revenue for the city, which is very good in order for us to meet our needs for schools, for roads, and for paying debt service, especially when you've got a desire on the part of many in the community to float more bonds to build more affordable housing. However, I will say that when a building like the Flats had flipped ownership back in 2016, it was sold for $77 million thereabouts. That is what increased assessments. That is also what then generated a real problem with low-income homeowners and renters.
Scott, 45 seconds.
I see the problem as very much the opposite, in the sense that because we keep so many other areas of the city restrictively zoned, it artificially inflates the land values in the areas that actually can get new housing. So the Flats, the areas along West Main and various other areas where let's say mid-rise condos and apartments are being built, because those are the narrow slices of the city that can be rezoned, they have artificially inflated land values. But that's because all the demand is being centered in those areas because the rest of the city is being underzoned. And so what I'm saying is that if we rezone the entire city, it brings more equilibrium to the land values in the entire supply and demand process. The demand can be spread across further parts of the city rather than concentrating in specific areas. And so I think the argument you're making is that the inflated land values along West Main magically cause land values in 10th and Page and Fifeville and adjacent neighborhoods to increase. I think it's actually the opposite.
Nicely done. All right, a lot of people watching. Frank Bailiff, the president and founder of Southern Development, watching the program right now.
Right.
We have Bo Dickerson of Dickerson Development, close to your family over there, Judah Wickower, watching the program. Bellamy Brown, running for city council, watching the show right now. One of your colleagues watching right now on the program. City Hall, I see you watching the program. Another question, we're going to come, a number of questions that are coming in. We have 3 past car presidents watching the show as we speak here. Let's get to Neil's question. Neil Williamson, Free Enterprise Forum. And we'll start with you.
Okay.
Why does government make the type of development, quote, we, quote, want the most difficult to build? You have 60 seconds on that one.
Wait, so I didn't understand the question.
He says, why does government make the type of development we want the most difficult to build in Charlottesville?
What's the we?
I think he means
the consumer.
The average Joe, I think is what he means.
I think that is a great point. It's a much more philosophical question than what we've delved into so far. But if a consumer wants a certain thing, whether it's single-family housing, whether it's townhomes, whether it's missing middle, living in 5-story walk-ups, I think the consumer demand is very diverse in Charlottesville and everywhere else. Why should the government get to decide what types of housing gets built where? Why should the Board of Architectural Review be able to determine the design of that? And why should the Planning Commission and City Council get to decide ultimately the zoning and in the process by whether or not it gets approved by right or SUP? I think it's a great philosophical question. My argument would be that the government should not be able to determine those things, that the consumer and the developer should be able to determine them instead.
Kathy, what do you think?
Well, I think you've just kind of trampled all over this concept called community visioning as embodied in our comprehensive plan. Let me just in a nutshell explain what the comp plan is. It's a community's idea of what it wants to be as it grows. And I would think in a nutshell, this community believes in equity, sustainability, health. It also believes in a sense of place, and it also understands the importance of viability. So 5 things that this local government then needs to monitor based on what this community has said to us that they want to achieve. So when you say that it's just going to be something, let the market rip, and the market's going to deal with equity, sustainability, health, sense of place, in viability, I will agree with you. It'll help with the viability in the sense it'll provide us with the revenue. But it is up to a local elected government that represents its community to make sure that those other cylinders are firing. And so I just want to stress that we have to be intentional about building more deeply affordable housing in this city. It's not going to be achieved by building more and more units. As we build more units, as you improve properties, they automatically inflate in value. I'm not saying we need to keep the restrictions that we have in place. I agree with you, but it's not all of it.
45 seconds to respond.
Okay, so let me clarify about the community because I think it's a couple things to say about the community. I think that when you have public land use meetings, the community, quote unquote, is not always represented. I think it's a very narrow slice of people who might have very, let's say, parochial interests in mind, and they might not be thinking about the broader community and the broader community principles. The other people who are, so I don't think community necessarily reflects the whole community. The other thing is the community does not reflect the people who want to live here, are about to move here, but have not done so yet, but are eventually want to because this is a good jobs market. They're not being represented in those meetings. So I think community tends to be very parochial, very self-interested, and more to the point, it tends to be obstructionist. Okay, so yes.
45 seconds.
So I'm gathering what you're summing up what a NIMBY means, not in my backyard. And I am very well aware of the problem that we have faced over the years of people just saying no to growth. I am not a no growth proponent, I'm a managed growth proponent. If we don't grow, we are not going to be addressing the needs of our children. We're not going to be addressing the needs of new immigrant communities, and we're certainly not going to assist our lower income communities to get the kind of resources and equity that they want to build over time for themselves and their children. So I am a proponent of growth, and I'm also very much aware of the fact that there are parochial interests that do invade the council chambers, be it the Planning Commission or City Council. That's why you do have a long but intense process to create what they call a comprehensive plan. It's something that we go into the neighborhoods, we go into our communities to find out really what we're talking about.
New question coming in. I believe it's Councilor Galvin's turn to start first on this one. This is from Ray Cadell, the real estate agent. How do we protect the existing homeowners who made their investment based on current specific zoning with regard to what might pop up next door, either through a special use permit or a zoning change? Good question. 60 seconds on the clock.
Well, that has been the argument of zoning all along. And just a little bit of history, zoning was put in place to keep noxious uses away from people's living quarters. So in the old days, in the 1920s, you didn't want your leather tannery next to your tenement house, although that's what actually happened. The low-income folks did very much get located in those kinds of noxious areas. Now, having said that, there's that important idea of loosening up the market so that you do allow a variety of use types. And that's why I think Scott and I will agree that not everything can happen in everyone's neighborhood, but there needs to be more variety of building types that can go in, that maintains the character, the physical character, not the social economic character, but the physical character of the place. And that's often what is related to what people call their land values. When you go and look at Alexandria, Virginia, for example, in Cheek and Jowl, you've got a public housing resident living next to a person that has $1 million. They coexist because the form is right. They're both living in the Alexandria townhouse form.
A minute on the clock.
My view of zoning is much less positive. I think to some degree it was approved. Well, it was approved by the Supreme Court because it, like you said, it separates noxious uses. But I think there's very much of a history of class and racial exclusion that has been written into zoning codes and dates back to the Progressive era. Great book you can read is Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, that talks about the history of that. And I think even today, so let's focus on this idea that zoning should be used to preserve your home values or even inflate your home values. Let's examine that. So that strikes me as the type of goal that is very much in contrast to having affordable housing. You can't have it both ways. And I'm looking at zoning as something that very much limits the ability to build affordable housing next to luxury housing. Kind of like what you were talking about in Alexandria. Zoning doesn't necessarily create that outcome. I think zoning prevents that outcome.
Actually, zoning can.
45 seconds to respond.
Zoning can actually introduce the idea of income mixing in a seamless way. And it has to do with not moving away from what they call Euclidean zoning, which is land use based, which is based on density. If you move towards an orientation that is more concerned about the physical form, the placement, then you wind up getting rid of even considering density criteria. What fits works. And what you start looking at is what makes sense within the context. What can your street handle in terms of infrastructure? Sidewalk width even matters. The more dense you get, the more wide your sidewalks should be. We've created a situation where we've put density in place, which cannot then take advantage of mass transit and walkable and bikeable landscapes because we don't have the infrastructure in place. And we've got multiple corridors, at least 10 of them, that have been determined to be high-density mixed-income corridors as we speak today. Right now, only one has really redeveloped, and that's West Main Street.
45 seconds, Scott.
Yes, I don't think zoning is what you use to put different income groups together. I think that zoning very much, you probably could use zoning that way, but in practice, zoning around the United States has done the precise opposite. To use an example in Charlottesville, a neighborhood like Fry's Spring, largely R1 zoned, maybe R1S, and that basically means that it is an exclusive neighborhood that cannot build affordable multifamily housing in most parts of that neighborhood. So in that case, it's being used as a segregationist tool, and I think that zoning 99.99% of the time is used for precisely that. It might be used to micromanage incomes in select areas around the country, but that's generally not the outcome of zoning.
Perfect timing right there. New question coming in. We'll move on. Ann Malik, welcome to the program. Board of Supervisors, Albemarle County. Her opponent is watching as well. That's Steve Harvey. New question to you. I think this whole forum started with a friendly and respectable conversation on Facebook about Flint Hill. You gave a very thorough analysis. You responded very thoroughly as well. You took the conversation, I believe, then to Mayor Walker's Facebook page. That conversation from her end to you was not as friendly, although you were trying to keep it that way. Let's talk Flint Hill in general, and then we'll get into specifics. I'm going to give you 60 seconds to start on that topic. Anywhere you want to go.
Okay, well, so Flint Hill, Southern Development comes in, has by right zoning for
Frank Bailiff watching right now.
For between 13 to 20 units built on Flint Hill. They apply for a PUD that would give them, I believe, 50 units and some other features. And I think to Councilor Galvin's point, maybe they weren't using the correct interpretation of the PUD as it had originally been written. But end of the day, they were providing up to 37 more units on that land. And I would look at that and say, well, we're in a housing shortage, and we should be allowing as many housing units as we can. Whereas now, they're just going to build by right. Each of those, it's going to be single-family homes. Each of those is probably going to be $500,000 to $600,000 sale price. And so that doesn't do very much for our affordability problem.
Oh, under 60 seconds. Thank you. 60 seconds, you're on the clock there.
So my response. Okay, So the idea of the Flint Hill problem, and I was very, very clear about this, a planned unit development has got to make sure that it is innovative and it's also going to be really detailed. It did neither. I'm looking at Laughlin Hills, for example, which is an excellent planned unit development. I'm looking at other cases of planned unit developments in the region that actually, Belvedere was one of them. However, when you use that tool to just give you the ultimate flexibility to put what is essentially just a stick of townhouses with front-loaded garages that highly compromises the walkable environment, where there's more curb cut than there is continuous sidewalk, that, to me, was a failure of imagination, and it did not meet the criteria of our zoning. So if you're going to use that tool, take advantage of it. I was not opposed to density, but as I said earlier, I'm all about sustainability, which means we've got to get multimodal in our approach to transportation. And I'm also all about making sure that this is a healthy community where there's actually discernible park space and where it's a place that you can have a sense of pride.
This is a hot topic. We'll extend the 45 seconds for this one question to 60 seconds. You're on the clock.
Sure thing. Okay, so when I was watching the council dialogue about this, you came out against it, and your main issue was the design flaws. What you saw as the design flaws. Mayor Walker and some of her fellow colleagues, their biggest issue was that it wasn't affordable enough. They didn't like the fact that it only set aside 5 units of the 50 as affordable. But again, this strikes me as making the perfect the enemy of the good, because now they're going to build something by right that has less affordable units in even worse design in the sense of like density versus sprawl. It's going to be a more sprawling design. And so I'm trying to figure out why do you and Mayor Walker and the other people, the unanimous council that voted against this, why do you think that's a net win for the city to reject them because it wasn't perfect, and now we're going to get an even worse project?
Because the only goal of building a just, sustainable, beautiful city is not only putting numbers of units packed into every green space that we have left. It is all about making sure that we meet our sustainability goals as well as our equity goals. And you're acting like this government doesn't matter. This is what government's for, is to make sure that we create the kind of place that we want to pass on to our children. And in this particular case, and I think it was Brook Hill or Brookwood, was the example that I gave, where you go down that street, there's no place to park because it's more driveway than it is curb. There's no place to walk safely because there's more driveway where the rear ends of cars are butting into you. This is not a good environment. And I think the thing is, we both agree we need to change our zoning. We need to flex it up. And I'm not saying that that's not a problem, but I'm also saying that we've got to get to the point where we do it all. It's not a zero-sum game.
Again,
we'll do this. This is a good topic here. An extra minute on this topic. Another 60 for you, another 60 for you.
For me, it's not even going to take a minute. I mean, she and her colleagues are saying things like equity and inclusion and affordability, and the only point that I'm trying to make is that the by right zoning is worse for those goals than just giving them the PUD. And so that's all I'm trying to say. It's one thing to theorize about a Platonic ideal of what development should be, but if you're going to choose option A and option A is worse than option B, then that strikes me as not a very good decision.
60 seconds. You have a full 60 if you want.
It's very important that we also maintain transparency and accountability to our public. That's what, when you have an ordinance that says something is supposed to be done, and then you have a comp plan that says something is supposed to be done, the onus is on those elected officials and those appointed officials to do the very best they can to meet those goals. There are many goals that need to be met. So what I'm saying is that when you get essentially a project that is simply like an R3 that's underutilizing the tool that's been put before it in order to create a better product, I am not going to go and make a mediocre decision and say, no, we just got to get units. No, I want to make sure that I am being accountable to my public who expects that when they have an ordinance, we enforce it. Now, I have actually gone out on a limb on several occasions. The Hinton Avenue rezoning, the Carlton Avenue rezoning, when I have seen that it has done everything at once: equity, sustainability, and sense of place.
All right, we're going to move on to another topic. 7 different real estate firms watching the program right now. Nest Realty, I see you. Roy Wheeler, I see you. Long and Foster, Real Estate 3. Give it a like, give it a share on any of the streams you're watching. You'll appreciate this. John Russell says, I don't agree with the councilwoman, but she brings a very, very, very good defense to today's show.
Thank you.
If you'd like to relay anything to the folks, I'm happy to do this. This is from a developer. 4 developers watching the program right now. Dickerson Development, Bo Dickerson's founder and CEO, is watching now. He has this question. I believe I start with you this time,
Okay.
Councilor Galvin. Scott and Kathy, how do you define affordable housing versus low-income housing? 60 seconds.
So low-income housing is trying to create opportunities for people that have area median incomes at 30% and below. We're talking at like $10,000 a year. That's very low income. And that, when I mentioned that housing needs assessment back in April 2018, that actually is our greatest need. About half of that 3,300 that we need right now is of that income level. So that cannot be met by the private sector. It cannot be built. It needs to be in partnership with our nonprofit housing providers, our housing authority, Habitat, the land trust. That's the groups that we need to be making sure that, yes, we have revenue coming in to then push back out to them to get that kind of deep affordability built. We also need to be harnessing the increment of change from our private development and channeling that into more dedicated funding streams to our housing fund.
Scott, 60 seconds, you're on the clock.
So the difference between low income and affordable housing, I agree. I think low income housing is something I would define as some sort of technical government program. It could be low income housing tax credits. It could be, I guess, Section 8, public housing in some cases, although that's fallen out of fashion. I agree with Councilor Galvin that for people who are at the very low end of the earning spectrum, there might need to be some sort of like subsidy to have deeply affordable housing. But as far as affordable housing in the more abstract, I think that affordable housing is just something that happens when you build a lot of housing. And in fact, we have seen this borne out around the country in certain markets, which is that markets that build a whole lot of housing usually see something called naturally occurring affordable housing. And that is Class B and C properties that are older, filter down to lower income segments, depreciate over time, and become affordable.
45 seconds to respond.
We've also seen if you don't have that done exactly right, the timing is critically important. You see teardowns. You see if you upzone a region, and I saw this in the Boston area, then you start tearing down your organically occurring affordable housing. Like the triple deckers was a perfect example in the Boston area that was built as workforce housing back in the turn of the last century for factory workers. My grandparents grew up in them. My mother grew up in one. So the thing is, when you start upzoning too rapidly, and they found this out in places like Chicago as well, it starts to a dynamic of teardowns, and you lose that naturally occurring affordable housing. So that's one comment. And so I think when you also say you flood the market with units, you're then also increasing demand for materials, for labor. You're inflating the very components that go into making that unit.
45 seconds, Scott.
Okay, so the problem again of using Boston and framing Boston a certain way is that Boston has some of the, at the metro level, has some of the lowest permits per population related to its population of any metro in the country. You can look at the Census Bureau. At a metro level, they add about 15,000 units per year. That is nothing. So again, it's kind of like Charlottesville. It's hyperinflated. You're seeing all these distortions like tearing down old housing and building new units. That's a distortion that's caused by the hyper-regulation and lack of building that takes place in Boston. The type of example that I would use would be a place like Houston, where they actually do build a lot of units all over the metro area. Many of them are new. The new units generally do not replace the old units. They're built infill, and they're built on greenfield lots. And yes, you have naturally occurring affordable housing. The stuff that was built in the 50s and 60s can now be bought, depending on the neighborhood, for $100,000. And so that's what I'm talking about. You can't look at Boston for that.
New topic, Airbnbs. It is your turn to go first now.
Okay.
This question's coming from Houston, Texas. Ed Pettit is watching the program. He says,
All right.
Are Airbnbs and other home sharing services worsening the housing crunch or providing homeowners a way to afford their mortgages and taxes in a quickly rising overhead community? 60 seconds, you're on the clock.
Okay, two ways to look at this. If you keep your housing supply inelastic, which is to say you don't build any new housing or enough new housing, then yes, Airbnb will worsen your problem because some of that limited stock of housing will get snapped up by Airbnb units. However, if you keep your housing supply elastic, such as Houston and other Sunbelt cities do, you build more housing and it's able to accommodate all the different forms of demand that may be flooding into the market. So if X number, say 5% of your units are going to be snapped up by Airbnb, you're still building more housing to accommodate the other segments of the demand market, in which case Airbnb is not providing the type of competition that it does in other markets.
60 seconds.
In that housing study that I mentioned, there were over a couple hundred units that had been basically taken over by Airbnb, which meant that they were taken out of the market for residential long-term. We do need to make sure, I am not opposed to Airbnb. I do see that as a very good way for people to subsidize their mortgage and to be able to afford where they're living. Yeah. I see that as the same tool to use for accessory dwelling units. We have an accessory dwelling unit in our house that conveyed when we bought the house in 1989. It is what has helped us pay off our mortgage. So I am not opposed to having and freeing up opportunities for homeowners to kind of take advantage of their parcels. It does mean that we need to make sure that we have the supply. I am not arguing against that. I am going to say that the Airbnb, though, needs to be carefully regulated. We do understand, and you don't like that word, but we need to know that it's being enforced in the way that the ordinance was written, so that we actually do have an on-site presence of the owner.
45 seconds to respond.
Okay, well, I guess I'm a little bit agnostic about the whole how it should be regulated. I think there's various answers you could have to that, but I'm glad that you're acknowledging that supply plays a role in this. Okay?
I have continually said that.
Okay, so I mean, because at the end of the day, it's a supply and demand thing, and I don't get this. I don't get the sense that it seems like there's a bit of a sentiment around Charlottesville that adding supply or rezoning certain areas of the city will somehow worsen the housing crisis. I think it's the complete opposite. The more density we rezone for, and the more housing we build, the more that the median home price will be suppressed or even be lowered in the city proper.
45 seconds, Councilor Galvin.
Are we still on the topic of Airbnb?
Well,
Yes.
yes, I'm making the larger philosophical point that if we increase the amount of supply to accommodate the demand, then Airbnb, which is one form of demand among many, will not have such an onerous burden on existing households.
So, again, I want to underscore, I'm not opposed to growth. I do want to make sure that we're doing it in such a way that we meet multiple goals at once. And I want to bring us down to this example of the form-based code that we've been talking about. A case study of a build-out was done on the 16 acres revolving around the Ix property, 16 acres. A maximum build-out was 2,000 units with a height bonus that was able to generate 147 affordable units on site. In concert with that, you have PHA, Piedmont Housing Alliance, the Housing Authority, Habitat, all building affordable housing in what they call the strategic investment area. So when you look at those build-out numbers with all those partnerships, with the fact that you've now got a market-driven build-out as well as developers building more affordable housing, we were able to determine that before and after, 25% of that area, of the SIA, the strategic investment area, is still for affordable housing. Displacement means when you lose that affordability range, it needs more than just supply. It needs intention.
This is a new question coming in.
Okay.
We'll go on. We're 52 minutes in here. We have a number of questions we're going to get into. I'm going to continue with this format for roughly 5 more minutes, and then we'll pick up the tempo and go 60 seconds per topic so we can get to as many as possible. This is a 2-part question from Matthew Gilligan, a Twitter rock star. 2-part question. Councilor Galvin, you will start. First part, how would a rezoning to allow duplexes or even triplexes and fourplexes citywide positively or negatively impact our housing situation? Second part, how politically feasible would such an upzoning be? 60 seconds.
Political feasibility is a hard thing to grab onto. I have already said I'm a proponent of changing our zoning to allow flexibility. And duplexes, triplexes, quadruplexes can all be made to work within our R1 zoning districts. Period. I am not opposed to that.
Would you like to respond? 60 seconds.
I don't really have much of a response. I largely agree with what you said. If you have a single family lot that is now zoned R1 and only one unit can go on it, suddenly you rezone it for a triplex, well, 3 households can live on that land. That's two additional units that exist in Charlottesville. If those 2 additional units are not built, then what's going to happen is the people who would live there will either live in the surrounding counties and commute in by automobile and put impacts on our streets. I don't think either Councilor Galvin or I think that's a very good solution. Or those 2 households would further subdivide or compete for our existing housing stock elsewhere in the city. So it's kind of like, and that further inflates and gentrifies our existing housing stock. So building those 2 extra units on that single family lot is going to be good for controlling affordability, and if we do it all across the city, then that's a lot more housing.
Councilor Galvin.
I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we have on the books, like I said, a tool to start repurposing, reusing, recycling our underdeveloped areas. Just for example, we passed a small area plan for the hydraulic Seminole Trail Shopping Center. That's 100 acres of asphalt parking lot in an area that is seeing declining brick and mortar retail. That is what we got to jump on, get new zoning in place so that can be repurposed. Right now, you've got it nearly impossible to build multifamily housing in that area. Plus, it's a degraded area. I would not want to live there. I don't think anybody would want to live in the middle of a shopping center as it's currently constituted. So what I'm saying, though, is that when you start looking at those 10 areas, they have a capacity, just say even if we get 20 acres of additional capacity where you can put more intense development, and then you can actually then have bands around it of less intense development as it butts up against your legacy neighborhoods, you start solving a lot of these supply issues that we're talking about.
You have 45 seconds to respond.
Sure thing. I mean, yes, let's add more density to those areas. I'd want to know, though, why do you think that, I've heard you mention several times, if we're going to have, say, a 5-story walk-up, if that's going to be what we rezone towards, why do we have to have bands of lower density around that? I think that gets back to some of the philosophical issues that Neil Williamson brought up, which are, it seems very pseudoscientific to me. Like, why do we have this principle that there has to be bands of lower density? Why does it have to be incremental like that? Why can't we just let the market build what consumers want?
You want to answer that?
I would like to answer that because I am a representative of the people I serve. And I have heard repeatedly, over and over again, people do not like the canyon effect over their homes. There's a real logic to having a sense of place and being respectful of the context. So having that transition area built in, it's a craft. It's paying attention to what you hear. It's being sensitive to the needs that are out there in your community. If you had upzoned the entire city to just be 9-story buildings everywhere, you wouldn't have even the goose that laid the golden egg anymore. People love Charlottesville because of its physical character, just as much as the fact that they have got a good food scene here, a good music scene. But all of that works together with that sense of place. And the reason why people started living here and coming here by the droves because of that sense of place. Now we got to make sure that we don't displace the people that have been living here for a long time.
We'll go to a new topic.
Okay.
New topic. I love the passion on this set right here. New topic. Chris Henry, welcome to the program. Dairy Market, Dairy Central. 9 different developers watching today's program right now.
Is anyone but developers watching?
I believe you go first this time. Is that right? Yes, it's your turn to go first on this topic right here. This topic is about public transportation. Mm-hmm. How can a public transportation system that's more reliable and robust impact affordable housing across the city of Charlottesville? You're on the clock.
Well, I think transportation is an undertold story about how much it costs people to commute long distances. We've got a lot of people that actually live in Waynesboro, they live in Greene, Madison, Fluvanna in order to work in Charlottesville. So Charlottesville is a job hub. We have to put more units of housing in Charlottesville so people can live close to where they work. That is a given. Our current zoning actually incents still commercial development over residential. That's got to get fixed. We've learned that in the downtown extended zoning. So having said that, you need to, and we're having these discussions now with the Regional Transit Partnership, a group that I'm on, that there's that concern about ridership versus coverage. Ridership does involve this density question. Coverage means getting out to everybody so that they can get to their job or get to the medical services they need. Coverage is expensive if you don't have the numbers of units that you need to sustain those bus stops. And it's also a problem when the bus has to go in and out in circuitous ways.
Al Schwarberg, CEO and founder of Keswick Vineyards, welcome to the program. 60 seconds, Scott.
Yes, I think the best way to improve our transportation situation, and in particularly to increase the ridership of our mass transit, is to build more housing in the core. And I think, as people have already seen who are watching the show, I'm far more adamant about that as far as rezoning all of the city and allowing housing to be built wherever the consumer wants it to be built. And I think that would have the effect of bringing much more density into Charlottesville, particularly in the core areas, and that is what will foster a good mass transit system. I think the ridership versus coverage debate will become a lot easier because it won't be much of a debate. There will be specific areas that have very obviously high demand for riders, and the ridership versus coverage debate will just kind of work itself out because we would know where to send the buses.
45 seconds to respond.
Actually, the way a fixed route works, which is the kind of service we have, it does need straight lines. It does need, like our corridor system, it does need to be able to then partner up and pair up with the first mile and the last mile solutions, which are often related to things like Lyft and Uber,
Yeah.
my God,
Yeah.
Lyft. I use Lyft. I don't use Uber. So having said that, it then allows you to put your density strategically. If we put our density strategically, say repurpose hydraulic, repurpose RIO, which is what the county's doing, then all of a sudden you're positioning yourself to have these actually nodes, these transit nodes that can, and maybe someday, sustain a bus rapid transit line up and down the corridor. And you've got the excess lanes to be able to accommodate that. So what I'm saying is that it's really important to put the density exactly where you need it. The folks in Flint Hill, if that was built, they would just be getting in their cars, driving to where they need to go.
Okay, I have a quick response to that. I do not think we need to fix the areas that we have density, because my definition of mass transit is not exclusive to just government-run public transit. It also includes the more flex routing that Lyft and Via and Uber do as well. So I think if you were to allow density to be more organic throughout the city, you'd not only have the better public transit along the fixed routes that you talked about, but you'd also have more nascent private transit industries rising up to meet the demand in other parts of the city that the public transit is not serving.
Nicely done. Within 45 seconds. New topic right here. Derek Knowlton, one of the owners of Three Notch, watching the program. You'll get a kick out of this, guys. John Russell is a city councilor in Culpeper. He says this is a fantastic show, a great way to spend my lunch break. You have somebody watching in Los Angeles that's close to you, Jane Donovan Staley, Staley Point Capital.
Oh my goodness,
and Los
Jane!
Angeles loves this discussion. We have a new topic that we
Hi.
need to get to. We're an hour in, so we'll pick up the pace and tempo. Why don't we have the answers be 60 seconds? We'll go 60
Okay.
seconds and 60 seconds.
Okay.
A lot we want to get to here. Land trust model. Okay? How can the land trust model solve our affordable housing crunch? You start.
It will be a contributor to the solution. And it can, if it becomes more robust, as the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust in Richmond, which I just recently learned has actually become also Richmond's land bank. So they have the capacity to acquire land, bank it, and then they build. That little community land trust has generated like 30 homes and over $1.5 million of mortgage financing in just the past year. I want our land trust to be as robust. 3 years ago, I pushed to get a land bank ordinance passed. It's been kind of held up with our different members of our community wanting to make sure it's written a certain way or it covers certain bases. I've been arguing the more we wait on these kinds of tools, the more our land value goes up. We need to have a very robust land bank. I would like to see more units built. It needs to have land to build on, and it needs to work in the space along with Piedmont Housing Alliance, the Housing Authority, Habitat, and now we've got the New Hill Community Development Corporation. So we've got some good space here.
60 seconds. Scott.
Yeah, I'm not opposed to it. I think that when you talk about how do you keep housing affordable in a place like Charlottesville, especially if it's going to be the new housing that's built, I think a land bank is one option you can have. If a private developer owns a plot of land, they're probably going to build market rate, and in the city, market rate is often $500,000 or $600,000 per new unit. If you have the government own it, and they can, to your point, they can find nonprofit or various low-income type of developers. They can leverage various state and federal tax credits, and they can build affordable housing, in many cases deeply affordable housing. The only thing I would want to warn about a land bank, just having studied it in other cities, would be that cities like Detroit and Philadelphia have collected a lot of land. Some of it because it's distressed, but I mean also just because that's sort of their mode of governance. And in many cases, they've underutilized the land and have kept it full of trash and needles and haven't really kept it maintained very well. So I would want to be wary of that if it were to ever happen in Charlottesville.
New topic. We're going to move on. Wendell Gibson, Gibson Development. Welcome to the program. Another builder watching the program here. Keith Smith, who's on the board at the Thomas Jefferson Land Trust, says it is a community land trust, says land banking and land trusts are part of a silver buckshot. There's no silver bullet. There is a silver buckshot, and land trusts are one element in the solution here. We'll go on to another topic here. This is of the University of Virginia. We have the University of Virginia President's Office watching the show right now. Also, Rick Randolph, Board of Supervisor in Albemarle County, watching the program. I'll give you 60 seconds on this topic. You actually start this time. What is the University of Virginia's role in assisting Charlottesville with its affordable housing dilemma and its public transportation inadequacies? Scott, you're on the clock.
So I do want to address an idea that came up in Lloyd Snook's campaign, and he was saying that UVA should be obligated actually to build more housing to take some of the demand pressures off of Charlottesville. You know, I'm not opposed to the idea because more housing is better than less housing, but I do want to point out that if UVA, correct me if I'm wrong, but if UVA builds this housing on grounds, then it's not taxable from the city's perspective. And so you have a bunch of students who are still going to be coming in using our services and not paying, and we won't get any property tax revenue from that development. Whereas if we just rezone the areas around UVA and allow private developers to build that housing, then we're getting massive tax receipts. And so I think that's an important thing to think about.
Councilor Galvin, 60 seconds.
The problem that I hear with that is that then the housing that we're building isn't going for our workforce, for our families, for our long-term residents. I think the problem we've seen with the standard and the flats is that it is a situation where it's almost become like an extension of the grounds. Even though we do get tax revenue from it, yes, that's good, but it's not fully using what we really need to do, which is have people be able to live close to where they work. I know about 1/3 of the units in the flats, for example, have been leased out to people that work in the medical center. That's great. That's great. But most of it is going to student housing. I think the university building more student housing on grounds is a very good plan. I also think I've had conversations with Rick Jones. He said that there is actually a surplus of apartments available for students still in the city. So there's got to be more dialogue, more discussion with the university and the private sector to figure out what that sweet spot is. But I do think that would help immensely.
Sure, quickly.
15-second response.
Yes.
I would say that if you build housing around the grounds, it is serving exactly who it needs to serve. People who want to work at UVA or attend UVA as a student are getting to live in that housing. It is doing exactly what it needs to do.
I'm going to add a follow-up question to this. You start on this one. UVA is considering requesting or demanding or insisting that second years live on grounds. This could potentially open up anywhere from 2,500 to 3,000 housing options for folks that are potentially local in the community. How will this impact our housing ecosystem?
It will reduce the strain on per unit costs, which is exactly what my friend across the table has been talking about. Now, I will say one of the lowest density developed areas in our city is the grounds and the UVA properties. I think it's something like 13% of our land is UVA. So consequently, use it. Use it to be in an urban university. I think when you look at any of the books, it's called a suburban campus. We are a city we need to be using our land for our residents and for our businesses. And the more we can co-locate them, the more that we get people out of their cars and using bikes and using buses and using their feet to get to where they need to work. That is highly sustainable from, given the fact that the transportation sector is responsible for about a third of our greenhouse gas emissions. So yeah, getting UVA to do its part to build student housing, and they are at the table at the Regional Transit Partnership. We are working to better coordinate their university transit service and ours.
60 seconds to respond.
Well, yeah, I agree with. I think it's good if UVA adds housing on campus. I don't know if it's the ideal situation because, like I said earlier, if you simply just upzone the area around the campus and let it be built within the city boundaries, then we collect the tax receipts. And I think you were talking earlier about the flats on West Main, the massive tax receipts because of the higher assessments that came from rezoning that property. Now multiply that over many lots and many times, and you've got way more tax receipts for the city, which, by the way, has debts to pay off, and so we want to keep our AAA bond rating. And I feel like it would be better if we kept that housing in the city rather than on grounds. But ultimately, it's a win-win either way. It's more housing.
Neil says the upward housing pressure is more from faculty than from students. A UVA land trust for faculty would help solve this crunch. We're going to go to another topic. This topic is from Grace. Jerry, I live in the 10th and Page neighborhood. I'm concerned about the integrity and the credibility and the long-term feasibility of our neighborhood with Dairy Market and Dairy Central coming on the horizon and all these big-time homes that cost upwards of $400,000 springing up around me. How do we maintain 10th and Page neighborhood for us that have been here our entire life? The first person on this one is you.
Yes, well, a couple things. I say we rezone areas besides just 10th and Page and besides just West Main. To my earlier point, if you rezone the entire city, then the demand gets spread across the entire city. It is not being concentrated on specific areas. And I think race is very much in play here because traditionally in Charlottesville and in other parts of the country, black neighborhoods often get targeted with the rezonings and the impacts that come from new development. And white neighborhoods are often insulated from that, and they have single-family zoning that does not see a lot of new development. So in a lot of ways, what I'm saying is, in my opinion, something that protects our traditional black neighborhoods, because I'm saying build all over the city, build in North Downtown, build in Fry Springs, build in Belmont, and it spreads the demand out a little bit.
60 seconds.
Well, I think, again, the inflationary pressure on a 10th and Page neighborhood is directly related to the fact that it is a neighborhood that is close to where people work. Many of the people that have bought those homes are young faculty, young families that work at UVA, and they've been fixing up the units. That inflates the value of their homes, and that overall inflates the tax assessments, which then translates into high property tax rates and fees for the long-term residents. So I've been a proponent of other programmatic tools. One's called the homestead exemption, and one is also called the tax circuit breaker. These are tools to kind of clear out the first, say, $100,000 of people's income tax or property value, so that you're not dealing with the cost of the burden of that inflated land value. So I just say that because we've got to start putting a cap on some of the inflation of the tax requirements themselves that our low-income residents are experiencing because of this.
Two more questions. I'm mindful of their time. We're at 1:41. I promised them out of here at 1:45. Two more questions. I'm sorry we will not get to all your questions today. I appreciate you watching the program. You're first on this with 60 seconds on the clock. How can Albemarle County help Charlottesville with its affordable housing problems?
Well, I am a proponent of making Albemarle County be a strong employment engine as well. If we start creating new employment centers with residential areas around them, guess what? We start creating that dynamic that we have in the downtown mall area, in the corner area. The problem is we have become the major job center for the region. And that is the big displacement, and that is the big mismatch. We're we've got more jobs than we need for the people that live here. And it's like, so how do we accommodate the people that are currently working here? But let's repurpose and recycle those shopping centers to be other kinds of engines of employment so that we can then actually have viable places for people to live, work, and play. We're kind of in this situation where we're the donut hole, surrounded by older suburban land patterns that increasingly people don't want to live in. And so let's make more of them out there. That's what the neighborhood model district was all about. That's why we need to rezone Rio Road, hydraulic. That's why I supported the Southwood Mobile Home redevelopment.
60 seconds, Scott.
Yes, I think Albemarle could be doing a lot. I would argue that it is even more NIMBY than Charlottesville in the sense that Charlottesville has a huge mismatch between the amount of housing it builds compared to the jobs and population growth that we have. So already we got a mismatch here. Mm-hmm. And in Albemarle, it's very much the same thing. Their zoning is even more restrictive. What I think 10% of the county is zoned for growth area, or maybe even less, and then the remainder of it, the remaining 90%, is zoned for some combination of large lot suburban and agriculture and nature preserve. And so it's more or less a growth boundary that has been put around this area. And so I think the solutions are some combination of, to her point, dramatically rezone the growth areas. Something like 29 North should not be a strip mall. We could be rezoning it for 5-story walk-ups. And Great Eastern Management Company already wants to do that for, I believe, Seminole Square, and we could be doing that all up and down the corridor. But also, I think more of the large lot zoning areas could be opened up to subdivisions and various things like that.
Final question. This is from Chris Daniels' fantastic program. I've watched it from start to finish. The knowledge on this set is truly amazing. Good job, guys.
Thank you.
We're going to close on this note right here. Neil says less than 5% of Albemarle is designated for growth. He's watched the show from start to finish.
Less than 5, okay.
This right here is the final question. It's kind of a macro question. We'll give each of you 90 seconds. What will the next, you go first on this
okay.
side. What will the next 10 years look like in Charlottesville's housing universe? 90 seconds.
That is a tough thing to predict. So at the nationwide level, there is a fledgling YIMBY movement, which are a young generation of people who are typically renters. They have been priced out of the home buying market, and they have formed little grassroots organizations to call on the political establishment to build more housing and loosen up its zoning. And so those YIMBY movement, the YIMBY movement is a larger movement, but there's little subsets of it in San Francisco and Los Angeles and New York City, Portland, basically any place that's dealing with a affordable housing crisis. I think that we need a YIMBY movement here in Charlottesville. I think that renters, the people renting in the city, are the ones that are taking the brunt of our housing crisis, and they need to form a movement and understand their own interest in saying that we need to change our zoning and build more housing so that there is more housing for us and we're not all having to compete for the same limited stock. Okay, and so I think if we can get that political momentum here in Charlottesville, I think there will be more pressure on our political establishment to rezone and to build more housing. If we cannot organized in that manner, then I think we're going to get the status quo as we have for a long time, which is a vast majority of our city is zoned single family. Redevelopment can only happen in targeted areas, and it's been that way for decades, and it will continue to be that way unless things change.
Councilor Galvin, you're closing the program.
Okay, so the YIMBY movement, yes, in my backyard. When you look at that YIMBY movement, it seems to be a coalition of affordable housing activists, mass transit activists, also what they call urbanists, people that love cities and want to see cities thrive. That also means when you look at those different categories, they represent what I was talking about, the balance of equity and sustainability, viability, and health, all at once. So I see, with a vision that's bought in by our community, and with affordable housing strategy that is comprehensive, by that I mean it looks into the planning and zoning, it looks at the programmatic changes, and it looks at the financial and fiscal changes that we have to do. and then we move forward with rezoning the entire city so that we do create opportunities for all, both in terms of housing choice, in terms of employment choice, transportation choice, I'm talking about choice, then we will see truly a just, sustainable, and beautiful city in the next 10 years. And we will meet our goals, and we will all be in a situation where we can have a pride of place.
Good place to close. Today's show was fantastic. 1:45 on the clock. We'll add this last comment. This is from Keith Smith. I'm the chairman of the Regional Housing Partnership. A healthy housing system is regional. All our meetings are open to the public. Please attend. We're working hard on each of these items, and we want public forum and public comment. Thank you, Keith. Thank you to Scott Beyer.
Thank you.
Thank you to
Yeah.
Kathy
This is
Galvin.
great.
It was
Yeah.
fun. It was
Thanks
totally
for
fun.
coming
This is
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
I'm sad you're going to be going away.
You're going to New York City, right?
Yeah, like a month.
Okay. He's
Yeah.
launching a consulting firm?
That's right.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
continuing my journalism career.
Yeah. And I wish you
Well,
the
I'm
best of luck.
sad that Governing Magazine has ended, because I know
Yeah.
you were a contributor to that, and I was an avid reader every month.
Yeah.
I'm going to miss it.
This is a perfect example of what a respectful dialogue can look like. They didn't agree on everything, but we did it in a way that was respectful. Great show. Thank you to Scott and Kathy from Bo Dickerson of Dickerson Development.
thank you.
We
Thank
close
you.
the program the same way every time. We ask everybody to embody the golden rule. We don't make it about religion. We make it about treating other people how you want to be treated yourself. It's the golden rule. Charlottesville needs it more than ever, the Commonwealth, and we certainly know the country needs the
Yes.
golden rule more than ever. Enjoy your afternoon, guys. Great work.
Wow.
Excellent work.
Thank you.
Excellent
Yeah,
work.
I loved
Excellent
it.
work.
I really
Excellent
loved
work.
it. Really, it's great
Yeah,
to
thanks
have.
for coming on.
It's great to have a conversation where you get into this stuff.
It was great.
And you don't get,
Screen.
scoffed at.
Right. That was great. One more thing, we're going to get a photo and we'll get you guys out of here. 10 minutes till 2.